They called her Shaky Hands. For 6 agonizing months, Elara Vance had endured the snickers and the condescending glances in the pristine, unforgiving corridors of St. Jude's Medical Center. She was just a nursing student, older than the others, with a quietness that was often mistaken for incompetence and a persistent, fine tremor in her hands that was mistaken for fear. She fetched coffee, changed bedpans, and endured the theatrical tirades of the hospital's golden boy, Dr. Adrian Thorne. They didn't know that the tremor was a ghost of a war they couldn't imagine, a phantom echo of pressure and shrapnel. They didn't know that those same hands had performed miracles in the dust and chaos of a Kandahar firefight, guided by nothing but a failing headlamp and a will of forged steel. They didn't expect the day a routine post-op would spiral into a code blue, when the orchestra of beeping machines would flatline into a symphony of death. Elara Vance wasn't just a nursing student. Elara Vance was a weapon held in reserve, and they were about to pull the pin. The air in the cardiothoracic wing was always the same, a chilled, sterile cocktail of antiseptic, floor polish, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that clung to the air scrubbers. It was an environment designed for precision, for control, an environment Dr. Adrian Thorne believed was his personal kingdom. He moved through the halls like a prince surveying his domain, his custom-tailored lab coat immaculate, his $30,000 Patek Philippe watch catching the cold fluorescent light. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a voice that could curdle milk. His reputation was built on a foundation of his father's donations to the hospital and a godlike confidence that intimidated residents and charmed the board. His actual surgical skill was, to the few who dared to look closely, merely adequate. But adequacy, when wrapped in charisma and wealth, looked a lot like brilliance. Elara Vance was the polar opposite. Her scrubs were a faded, soft blue, washed so many times they had lost their institutional stiffness. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe bun, and her face, pale and often tired, was utterly unremarkable until you looked at her eyes. They were a deep, startling gray, and in their depths was a stillness, a profound calm that seemed entirely at odds with the tremor that afflicted her hands. Today, the tremor was worse. A low-pressure system was moving in, and the ache in her shoulder, where a piece of metal was still embedded too close to her brachial plexus to be safely removed, was a dull, insistent throb. It made the shaking more pronounced. "Vance!" Dr. Thorne's voice was a whip-crack down the hallway. He didn't look at her, instead gesturing imperiously with a gold pen towards a chart. "The vitals on Mr. Henderson in ICU 7. Did you manage to write them down without your palsied scribbling making them illegible?" A few of the younger nurses, sycophants who orbited Thorne like nervous moons, tittered. Elara felt the familiar hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but her face remained a mask of placid neutrality. "Yes, doctor, they're charted. BP is stable at 125/80. Heart rate is 68. O2 saturation is 99% on room air." Her voice was soft, raspy, as if it were rarely used. Thorne finally deigned to look at her, his gaze flicking dismissively over her worn scrubs before landing on her hands, which she instinctively tried to still by tucking them into her pockets. "Miraculous," he said with a dripping sarcasm that was his trademark. "Don't get too comfortable. I want you to empty his drains and measure the output. And for God's sake, try not to spill anything. It's a biohazard, not a canvas for your abstract expressionism." He turned on his heel, the sycophants trailing in his wake, leaving Alara alone in the echoing hallway. The air seemed to shift, heavy with her humiliation. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind she had learned to take when the world was exploding around her. It wasn't anger she felt, not anymore. It was a cold, patient certainty, a sense of a debt coming due. She had no idea how soon it would be collected. She walked towards ICU 7, her worn sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. The hospital was a different kind of war zone, but the rules were the same. Stay calm, do your job, and wait for the moment everything goes wrong. Because it always, always does. The only difference was that here, the enemy wore a lab coat and a condescending smirk. Mr. Henderson, the patient in ICU 7, was a retired firefighter with a chest like a barrel and kind eyes. He'd had a straightforward triple bypass 2 days ago, a routine procedure for a surgeon of Thorne's supposed caliber. Alara checked the chest tube drainage system, her movements economical and precise despite the tremor. She noted the color of the fluid, serosanguinous, a normal pinkish red, and measured the volume. 40 cubic centimeters in the last hour. Acceptable. But as she recorded the number on the chart, her eyes lingered on the drainage chamber. Something felt wrong. It was a flicker of intuition, a pattern recognition honed in a place where the smallest deviation from the baseline meant imminent danger. The output was within normal limits, but the rate of change felt off. It had been 20 cubic centimeters the hour before. The doubling was subtle, something most would overlook. She made a small, almost invisible pencil mark next to the entry, a flag for herself. She continued her rounds, a ghost in the bustling ecosystem of the ward. She changed an IV bag for a fretful elderly woman, her touch so gentle the woman didn't even stir. She recalibrated a ventilator for a young man from a car accident, her fingers dancing over the control panel with an innate understanding of pressure and volume that had nothing to do with her nursing textbooks. These were small, quiet acts of competence, performed in the shadows, unseen and uncredited. They were muscle memory from a life she never spoke of. The nurses saw her shaking hands and her quiet demeanor and filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. Nervous, slow, fragile. They didn't see the woman who had once held a soldier's aorta closed with 2 fingers for 17 minutes while waiting for evac, her own blood mixing with his in the sand. Later that afternoon, Dr. Thorne held court at the nurses' station, regaling his audience with a story about his recent yachting trip to Monaco. He was loud, performative, his laughter booming through the ward. He paused to take a sip of the expensive latte a resident had fetched for him, and as he set it down, he deliberately nudged it with his elbow, sending the steaming cup cascading directly onto Alara's charting paperwork. "Vance, my God!" he roared, feigning shock. "Look at this mess. Can't you even stand still without causing a disaster? This is a sterile environment. Your clumsiness is a liability." The hot liquid soaked through the papers, scalding her hand. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, looking at the spreading brown stain, the smell of burnt sugar and milk filling the air. The circle of nurses around Thorne exchanged looks, a mixture of pity and cruel amusement. "I'm sorry, Doctor," she said, her voice a low monotone. "I'll clean it up." "You're damn right you will," he snapped, "and you'll rechart everything you've ruined. Maybe this time, try to keep your chaotic energy contained. Some of us are trying to practice medicine here." He swaggered away, pleased with his little show of dominance. As Alara gathered the soggy, ruined papers, she saw the faint pencil mark she'd made next to Mr. Henderson's chest tube output. It was smeared, but still visible. A warning. The tremor in her hands was suddenly worse, but it wasn't from the burn or the humiliation. It was the low thrum of adrenaline, the familiar precursor to violence and crisis. The air in the hospital felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The universe was winding a spring, and Alara could feel the tension in her bones, in the very marrow of her being.
The countdown had begun.
Even if she was the only one who could hear the ticking. The rain started just after 4 p.m., a sudden, violent downpour that lashed against the panoramic windows of the ICU. It turned the sky a bruised purple grey, and the rhythmic drumming of water against glass became a somber percussion to the steady beeping of the cardiac monitors. Alara was finishing her recharting, her handwriting meticulous and clear, a stark defiance of Thorne's accusations. Each letter was perfectly formed, a testament to a discipline forged under unimaginable pressure. She was just noting Mr. Henderson's latest vitals, BP 110/70, a slight drop, but still within an acceptable range, when the first alarm shrieked through the unit. It wasn't the loud, insistent clang of a fire alarm, but something far more terrifying to the people in this building, the high-pitched, frantic bleating of a code blue. Every head on the floor snapped towards ICU 7, Mr. Henderson's room, the room where, just moments before, everything had been stable. The air seemed to crystallize. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A tray of instruments clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, suffocating silence that followed the initial alarm. Then, chaos erupted. Nurses scrambled, a crash cart was summoned, its wheels rattling over the linoleum. "Code Blue ICU 7! Code Blue ICU 7!" A voice crackled over the hospital's PA system, robotic and devoid of the panic that was now palpable on the floor. Dr. Thorne, who had been loudly complaining about the quality of the hospital's Wi-Fi, was the first to burst into the room. He projected an aura of command, but Alara saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow. This wasn't a scheduled procedure. This was an ambush. "What the hell is happening?" he barked, shoving a junior nurse out of his way to get to the bedside. "Mr.
Henderson's face was ashen,
his lips tinged with blue. The monitor above his bed was a nightmare of falling numbers and frantic waveforms. His blood pressure was plummeting, 80/40 and still dropping. His heart rate, once a steady 68, was now a thready, tachycardic gallop over 150. "He just crashed, doctor," a nurse stammered. "V-fib." "Well, don't just stand there. Charge the paddles," Thorne roared, grabbing the defibrillator paddles from the crash cart. He was fumbling, his movements jerky. "Charge to 200. The machine whined as it powered up. "Clear," he yelled, pressing the paddles to Mr. Henderson's chest. The patient's body arched violently off the bed, a grotesque, involuntary spasm. The monitor blipped, then returned to the same chaotic, useless rhythm. "No change," someone shouted. "Charge to 300, Thorne commanded, his voice growing shrill. He shocked him again, and again. Nothing. The beautiful, orderly lines on the monitor had degraded into a frantic, meaningless scribble. It was the signature of a dying heart. Alara stood at the doorway, watching. She wasn't just a nursing student anymore. She was an assessor, a diagnostician. And what she saw was not a simple cardiac arrest. This was something else. She saw the distended veins in Mr. Henderson's neck, the muffled, distant quality of his heart sounds that she could practically hear from across the room. She saw the rapidly dropping blood pressure despite the electrical chaos. It was a classic, terrifying triad. Beck's triad. "It's not working!" Thorne screamed, sweat now pouring down his face, staining the collar of his expensive shirt. "Give him 1 milligram of epi." He was just throwing the standard ACLS algorithm at the problem, a cookbook approach that was failing catastrophically. He was trying to fix the electricity, but the problem wasn't the wiring. The house was flooding. Alara knew what was happening. The doubling chest tube output, the subtle drop in pressure, the sudden, catastrophic collapse. It was a pericardial tamponade. Blood was filling the sac around Mr. Henderson's heart, squeezing it, preventing it from beating properly. Defibrillation was useless. It was like trying to jumpstart a car that was being crushed in a hydraulic press. They were running out of time. The monitor began to emit a single, continuous, soul-destroying tone. Asystole. Flatline. Mr. Henderson was dead, or as close to it as a man could be and still have a chance. A very, very small chance. And in that moment, something inside Alara Vance broke. Or rather, something was unshackled. The quiet, deferential nursing student vanished. In her place stood Sergeant First Class Vance, call sign Angel, Senior Medic, 1st Special Forces Group. And she was not about to let another good man die on her watch. The high, keening note of the flatline hung in the air, a death sentence. The room was a tableau of defeated panic. Nurses stood frozen, their faces pale. Dr. Thorne stared at the monitor, his handsome features slack with disbelief and horror. He had failed. Publicly. Catastrophically. "Call it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Time of death?" "No." The word was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. It wasn't the raspy, hesitant voice of the nursing student. This voice was steel. It was command. Every head turned towards the doorway. Alara Vance stepped into the room. She didn't walk. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace that seemed utterly alien to the clumsy, shy woman they thought they knew. Her eyes, those still grey eyes, were now burning with a cold, terrifying fire. The tremor in her hands was gone. Utterly. They were as steady as granite. "You're calling it wrong, Doctor," she said, her voice low and resonant. "This isn't a primary cardiac arrest. It's an obstructive shock. He has a tamponade." Thorne stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. "A what? Who the hell do you think you are? You're a student. Get out of this room," he shrieked, his composure completely shattered. Alara didn't even look at him. Her focus was entirely on the patient, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. Seconds were ticking away. Brain death was minutes away. "I need a 16-gauge pericardiocentesis needle, a 60 cubic centimeter syringe, sterile gloves, and an ECG lead with an alligator clip. Now," she commanded. The authority in her voice was absolute. It was the voice of someone who had given orders while under fire, a voice that expected and received instant obedience. One of the younger nurses, a woman named Chloe, who had always offered Alara a kind word, simply stared for a second, then broke from her paralysis and scrambled to the crash cart. "A pericardiocentesis? Are you insane?" Thorne sputtered, stepping in front of her to block her path to the bed. "That's an incredibly dangerous procedure. You could puncture the myocardium. I'm the attending physician here, and I forbid it." Alara didn't break stride. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, and for the first time, Thorne saw what was truly behind her eyes. It wasn't fear or nervousness.
It was a chilling emptiness.
The look of someone who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had walked out the other side. "You have already failed, Doctor," she stated, the words delivered like clinical facts. "His heart is being crushed. Your defibrillator is useless. In approximately 90 seconds, he will be irreversibly brain dead. You have two choices. You can step aside and let me save his life, or you can stand there and be the man who let him die. Your choice." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the single, damning note from the monitor and the drumming of the rain. Thorne looked from Alara's face to the ashen face of his patient, then back. He saw no doubt in her, no hesitation. He saw a certainty that terrified him to his core. He took an involuntary step back. It was all the space she needed. Chloe thrust the requested equipment into her hands. Alara pulled on the sterile gloves with a snap of latex that echoed in the silence. Her movements were a blur of terrifying efficiency. She ripped open Mr. Henderson's gown, exposing his chest. She attached the alligator clip from the ECG lead to the base of the long pericardiocentesis needle, a trick she'd learned in the field to create a makeshift epicardial ECG to know the second the needle touched the heart muscle. She took the massive syringe and needle, a combination that looked more like a weapon than a medical instrument, and without a moment's hesitation, she found her landmark. Just below the xiphoid process, angled at 45 degrees, aimed towards the left shoulder. "I'm going in," she said, to no one in particular, and she pushed. The needle slid into the chest of the man who was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. The room held its collective breath. This was either murder or a miracle. There was no in-between. Dr. Thorne watched, his face a mask of horrified fascination. What he was witnessing was impossible. A nursing student, a clumsy, nervous woman he had personally tormented for months, was performing one of the riskiest bedside procedures in emergency medicine, with a speed and confidence he had never seen, not even from the most seasoned cardiothoracic surgeons. Her hands, those shaky hands he had mocked, were now the steadiest things in the universe. The long needle advanced. 1 centimeter, 2. Alara's eyes were locked on the ECG monitor she had jury-rigged. The flat line remained. She advanced the needle another millimeter, her touch impossibly delicate. Suddenly, the ECG waveform flickered. A massive, bizarre spike, an ST elevation, appeared on the screen. "Contact," she murmured. The needle tip had just touched the outer wall of the heart, the epicardium. She withdrew the needle by a fraction of a millimeter, just enough to be back in the fluid-filled pericardial sac. Then she started to pull back on the syringe's plunger. Nothing. For a heart-stopping second, the syringe remained empty. Thorne let out a choked, triumphant sound. "She missed. She's in the liver. His words died in his throat. A dark, non-clotting swirl of blood began to fill the syringe. 10 cubic centimeters, 20 cubic centimeters, 30 cubic centimeters. It was old blood, the blood from a slow bleed that had finally reached a critical point. As the syringe filled, something miraculous happened on the monitor. The flat line, the long, unbroken note of death, wavered. A single, weak electrical complex appeared. A P wave, followed by a QRS. A heartbeat. Then another, and another. Slow, agonal, but there. It was life, clawing its way back from the abyss. "He's got a rhythm," Chloe gasped, her voice filled with awe. The heart rate on the monitor climbed from 0 to 30, then 40. A weak pulse was palpable at the carotid. Alara had pulled nearly 60 cubic centimeters of blood from the sac, and she quickly attached a stopcock and a drainage bag to continue relieving the pressure. The color began to return to Mr.
Henderson's face.
A faint pink blush chasing away the deathly grey. His blood pressure, which had been non-existent, registered a faint 70/40. It was dangerously low, but it was there. It was a number. It was life. The room, which had been frozen in tension, erupted in a collective, shuddering gasp of relief. Nurses stared at Alara, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning, profound respect. They had just witnessed a resurrection. Thorne, however, saw his authority, his entire world, crumbling. This quiet, insignificant student had just succeeded where he had catastrophically failed, and she had done it in the most dramatic way imaginable, in front of his entire staff. The humiliation was a physical burn. His panic morphed into a desperate, furious rage. "What have you done?" he snarled, finding his voice. "You violated every protocol. You performed a procedure you are not remotely qualified for. I'm calling security. You're finished. Your career, your license, it's over." He lunged for the phone on the wall, his hand shaking far more than Alara's ever had. Alara didn't even look at him. She was focused on her patient, adjusting the flow of a dopamine drip that another nurse had silently prepared for her. "His pressure is still too low," she said, her voice calm and clinical. "The tamponade is temporarily relieved, but the bleed is likely from a ruptured suture on the atrial graft. He needs to go back to the OR, immediately. And you," she finally turned her head, her cold grey eyes pinning Thorne to the spot, "are not the surgeon who is going to take him there." The insult was devastating in its quiet delivery. It wasn't a challenge, it was a statement of fact. Thorne froze, his hand hovering over the phone, his face contorted in a mask of apoplectic fury. Before he could scream another threat, the doors to the ICU burst open again. But it wasn't security, it was a different kind of authority altogether. Hospital Director Matthews, a man whose face was a permanent mask of worried bureaucracy, scurried in, followed by two men who did not belong in a hospital. They were tall, ramrods straight, and wore immaculate dark suits that failed to conceal the military bearing beneath. The man in the lead had silver hair cut brutally short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, a piercing blue, swept the room, taking in the scene with an unnerving, practiced calm. They landed on Alara. A flicker of recognition, of profound relief, crossed his features. "Vance?" The man's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a voice accustomed to commanding armies. "I was told there was a situation." Director Matthews scurried forward, his face slick with sweat. "General Stryker, I am so sorry you had to see this. We had a code blue and this student," he gestured wildly at Alara, "went completely rogue. She assaulted a patient with a needle. Dr. Thorne was just calling security." Dr. Thorne seized the opportunity, his voice dripping with vindication. "That's right. General, I apologize for this chaos. This woman is unstable. She needs to be removed immediately. She nearly killed him." General Marcus Stryker's gaze shifted from Alara to Dr. Thorne. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment, the kind a god might give a particularly stupid insect just before crushing it. The general took a slow step forward, his polished shoes making no sound. "Dr. Thorne, is it?" he rumbled, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "You say she nearly killed him?" He gestured to the monitor, where Mr. Henderson's heart rate was now a steady 75, and his blood pressure was a respectable 100/60. The man whose monitor was flatlining 60 seconds ago? That man? Thorne's bravado began to falter under that glacial stare. Well, she got lucky. It was a reckless, unsanctioned procedure. She has no credentials, no authority. General Stryker took another step. He was now standing directly in front of the arrogant doctor, who suddenly seemed small and insignificant. Credentials, the general repeated, the word laced with contempt. He turned his head slightly to look at Alara, who was calmly checking Mr. Henderson's pupils.
A hint of warmth,
Of immense pride, entered his voice. Doctor, you have no idea who you're talking to. This is not just a nursing student. This is Sergeant First Class Alara Vance. He paused, letting the rank hang in the air. For 6 years, she was the senior combat medic attached to a Tier 1 Special Forces unit operating in the most hostile territory on this planet. They didn't call her Shaky Hands where she comes from. They called her the Angel of Kandahar. A collective gasp swept through the room. The nurses, the resident, even Director Matthews stared at Alara as if seeing her for the first time. The worn scrubs, the quiet demeanor, the shaking hands. It all recontextualized into something entirely different. Not weakness, but survival. Not incompetence, but profound, hidden strength.
Thorne's face went white.
Combat medic? That's not a surgeon. It doesn't give her the right. The general cut him off with a slice of his hand. The procedure she just performed? She's done it 6 times, in the back of a Black Hawk, under fire, with nothing but a flashlight and her training. The last man she did that to was my son, after an IED blast. His voice dropped, becoming thick with emotion. She held his heart in her hand, Doctor, and she did not let it stop. She is the only reason he is alive today. The man you are treating, he gestured to Mr. Henderson, is Sergeant Major Frank Henderson, retired. 30 years in the Army Rangers. He is one of my oldest friends. I was here visiting him. The final pieces clicked into place with an audible, soul-crushing clang for Dr. Thorne. This wasn't just a random patient. This wasn't just a random student. This was a catastrophic, career-ending alignment of fate.
General Stryker
Turned his full, undivided attention back to Thorne. Her shaky hands, as you so callously put it, are the result of nerve damage she sustained while shielding 2 wounded soldiers from a grenade blast. For that action, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's 2nd highest award for valor. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. She has more honor in her damaged nerves than you have in your entire privileged body. You stood by and were about to let a good man die out of sheer arrogance and incompetence. She, on the other hand, did what she was trained to do. She saved a life. The general's gaze was relentless. So you will stand down. You will not touch that phone. You will not speak to her or about her again. You will turn over this patient's care to a competent surgeon,
and then you and I
are going to have a conversation with Director Matthews about the future of your employment. Am I clear? It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Dr. Adrian Thorne, the Golden Prince of St. Jude's, stood there, stripped bare in front of his acolytes. His face, once handsome and confident, was now a pathetic mask of terror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. All that emerged was a small, choked whimper. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady, life-affirming beep of Mr. Henderson's cardiac monitor. Dr. Thorne seemed to shrink, his expensive lab coat suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The sycophantic nurses who had once orbited him now took deliberate steps away, as if his failure were contagious. They wouldn't meet his eyes. They were all looking at Alara, their faces a canvas of awe and shame.
Director Matthews,
A man adept at sensing shifts in power, was already nodding vigorously. "Of course, General. Absolutely. Dr. Wells, our head of cardiothoracic surgery, is on her way. I am so sorry. We had no idea." His apology was directed at the General, but his eyes kept darting towards Alara, a new, fawning respect in them. Thorne finally found his voice, a pathetic, pleading whine that was a grotesque parody of his former arrogance. "But my reputation, my fellowship," he stammered, looking at the General like a child begging a parent.
General Stryker's face
Remained granite. "You are concerned about your reputation?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Sergeant Major Henderson has a wife and 3 grandchildren who were about to get a phone call that would have shattered their lives because you were too proud to admit you were out of your depth. Your reputation is the last thing anyone in this room is concerned with right now." He turned his back on Thorne, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to Alara's side. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice softening with a warmth reserved only for her. "Report." The shift in Alara was instantaneous.
The medic took over.
"Sir," she began, her voice crisp and clear, a world away from the mousy whisper they were used to. "Patient is a 68-year-old male, post-op day 2 from a CABG ×3. Presented with sudden hemodynamic collapse, unresponsive to defibrillation. Diagnosed with acute pericardial tamponade. Performed emergent pericardiocentesis at the bedside with approximately 80 cubic centimeters of non-clotting blood aspirated. Patient regains sinus rhythm and a perfusing blood pressure. He is hemodynamically stable for now, but I suspect an active bleed from a graft suture. He requires immediate surgical exploration and repair." It was a perfect, concise, professional report, delivered without a single tremor in her voice. The head of surgery, Dr. Wells, a formidable woman in her late 50s, arrived at that moment and overheard the last part of Alara's summary. She looked at the drained syringe, the monitor, the patient's vitals, and then at Alara. She didn't ask who she was. She simply nodded, a look of profound professional respect on her face. "That was a hell of a call," Dr. Wells said. "Let's get him to the OR. You," she pointed at Alara, "you're coming with us. I want to hear everything." As the team prepped Mr. Henderson for transport, Thorne made one last, desperate appeal, grabbing Director Matthews' arm. "Howard, please," he whimpered. "My father sits on the board. You can't let him do this." Matthews, a political animal to his core, simply shook his head, pulling his arm free with a look of disgust. "Your father's money can't buy back a man's life, Adrian. You're done." The public humiliation was complete. Stripped of his power, his sycophants, and his dignity, Dr. Adrian Thorne stood alone in the middle of the room, a ghost in his own kingdom. Security finally arrived, 2 burly guards who looked uncertainly at the scene. The general simply nodded at them. "Please escort Dr. Thorne to the director's office. He'll wait there for me." The guards, sensing the immense authority in the room, flanked Thorne, their expressions grim. As they led him away, a whimpering, broken man, he passed Alara. She didn't look at him. She was too busy saving a life. Her life. His comeuppance was just collateral damage. The real victory was the steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor, a sound more satisfying than any apology or act of revenge. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of justice. The surgery was a success. Dr. Wells, with Alara at her side in the operating room, found the ruptured suture on the right atrial graft, just as Alara had predicted. The repair was quick, the patient's recovery on the table immediate. In the scrub room afterwards, Dr. Wells turned to Alara, pulling down her surgical mask. "I've been a surgeon for 30 years, she said, her eyes shining with respect. "I've seen maybe 3 diagnoses that good, that fast, under that much pressure. Where in God's name did you learn to do that?" "Afghanistan, ma'am," Alara replied quietly, the ma'am a reflex of military discipline. "You learn to see the patterns, or you die." Dr. Wells shook her head in wonder. "Well, your nursing student days are over. As of this moment, you have a standing offer for a surgical residency in my department the second you graduate. I don't care what your grades are. I care about what I saw in there. I can teach someone to cut. I can't teach them to have hands like yours." She paused, then corrected herself. "I can't teach them to have a mind like yours." Later, after Mr. Henderson was settled in the recovery ICU, General Stryker found Alara in a small, quiet alcove overlooking the rain-soaked hospital garden. She was just standing there, her shoulders slumped, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. The tremor was back in her hands, a faint, familiar flutter. "They're shaking again," she said, looking down at them. "They always do, afterwards." "Let them shake," the general said, his voice gentle. He stood beside her, not crowding her, giving her space. "They've earned it." They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment, 2 soldiers in a foreign land. "Thank you, Alara," he said finally, "for Frank, and for my son." "Just doing my job, sir," she whispered, the ingrained response of 1,000 debriefs. "It's more than a job for you, and you know it," he countered softly. "It's who you are." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue satin, was a small, ornate pin, the insignia of the Army's Expert Field Medical Badge, but with a small star at its center, a special designation for valorous use in combat. "I was supposed to present this to you at a formal ceremony, but you disappeared on me, ran off to become a nursing student," he said with a wry smile. "Figured now is as good a time as any." He took the pin, and with a gentleness that belied his gruff exterior, he carefully fastened it to the collar of her faded blue scrubs. It shone against the worn fabric, a beacon of hidden truth. "Don't ever hide who you are again, Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This world needs people like you. This hospital needs people like you." Alara looked down at the pin, her fingers tracing its sharp, metallic edges. For the first time all day, her composure cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, washing away the grime and exhaustion. It wasn't a tear of sadness or relief. It was a tear of recognition, of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. The hospital director found them there. He cleared his throat, his demeanor now obsequiously respectful. "Ms. Vance, Sergeant Vance," he corrected himself hastily, "on behalf of St. Jude's Medical Center, I want to offer our most profound apologies and our deepest gratitude. Dr. Thorne has been suspended, pending a full board review, which I assure you will result in his permanent termination. The hospital will, of course, be covering the full cost of your tuition and offering you a scholarship for your continued medical education, should you choose to accept Dr. Wells's offer." Alara simply nodded, too emotionally drained to speak. The apologies and offers were just noise. The only thing that mattered was the quiet weight of the pin on her collar and the knowledge that a good man was alive upstairs because she had been there. That was the only validation she had ever needed. 2 weeks later, the rain had given way to a fragile, hopeful spring. The corridors of St. Jude's were different. The whispers that followed Alara Vance were no longer of mockery, but of awe. They didn't call her Shaky Hands anymore. They called her the Angel, the story of ICU 7 having already become the stuff of hospital legend. Dr. Adrian Thorne was gone. A small article in the local paper had noted his resignation for personal reasons. But everyone at St. Jude's knew the truth. His career was over, buried under the weight of his own arrogance and a stack of malpractice lawsuits that were just beginning to pile up. Alara walked down the hallway to a different part of the hospital, the rehabilitation wing. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh today, the smell of antiseptic less oppressive. She stopped at room 312 and knocked softly. "Come in," a strong voice called out. She pushed the door open. Frank Henderson, the retired sergeant major, was sitting up in a chair by the window, doing a crossword puzzle. He was still pale, a long line of staples tracing a path down his sternum, but his eyes were clear and full of life. His wife, a warm woman with a kind smile, was sitting beside him. They both looked up as Alara entered. Frank's face broke into a wide grin. "Well, if it isn't my guardian angel," he boomed. "Get over here." Alara smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Just checking in on you, Sergeant Major, making sure you're not giving these nurses too much trouble." "This one?" his wife said, laughing. "He's a model patient, terrified of the nurses now, thinks one of them might be a secret Delta Force operator." Frank chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "The general told me everything," he said, his expression turning serious. "He told me what you did, what you risked." He reached out and took her hand. Her tremor was there, a slight, constant vibration. He held it firmly, his own hand calloused and strong. "Don't you ever be ashamed of these," he said, his voice thick with a soldier's gratitude. "These hands are a medal, you hear me? A medal." Alara felt that now familiar prickle behind her eyes, but this time she didn't fight it. She just nodded, unable to speak. That evening, back in her small, Spartan apartment, Alara made a decision. The offers from the hospital were generous: a full ride to medical school, a fast track to a surgical residency. It was everything she had been working towards. But as she stood in her quiet living room, she realized it wasn't what she wanted. Not anymore. The hospital, with its politics and egos, felt like a cage, gilded though it may be. Her purpose had been forged in a different fire. She opened an old wooden footlocker at the end of her bed. It smelled of canvas, dust, and ozone. Inside, nestled amongst neatly folded uniforms, was a small, lacquered box. She opened it. Lying on a bed of worn velvet was her Distinguished Service Cross. She picked it up. It felt heavy in her palm, a cold, solid piece of her past. She wasn't a surgeon. She wasn't a nursing student. She was a medic. Her place wasn't in a sterile OR, playing by rules made by men like Thorne. Her place was on the edge, in the chaos, where the rules didn't matter, and all that stood between life and death was a pair of hands, shaking or not, that knew what to do. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It was answered on the first ring. "Stryker?" "General," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's Vance." "Alara. I was hoping you'd call. Have you decided about the hospital's offer? I have, sir, she said. I'm grateful for it, but I'm declining. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see, the general said, a note of understanding in his voice. Where are you going? Alara looked at the medal in her hand, then out the window at the sprawling city. You told me the world needs people like me, she said. Dr. Wells is starting a new program, a fellowship in advanced trauma and remote medicine, training first responders, combat medics, flight nurses, people who run towards the fire. She mentioned it to me, Stryker said. She needs someone to lead it, someone who's been there. A slow smile spread across Alara's face. It felt right.
It felt like coming home.
Tell her I'll take the job, she said. My hands might shake, but they know how to teach. The true victory wasn't the downfall of one arrogant man. It was the rise of 100 more heroes she would train, a legacy of competence and courage spreading out from the echo of a single code blue, a ripple effect of saving lives that would extend far beyond the walls of St. Jude's. The Angel of Kandahar was back on duty.